So thanks everybody for tuning in to the IAA podcast. And for today's interview, I'm joined by a very special guest, my good friend and former professor, Rogerio Naressi. And
good to be here.
Yeah, good to see you. And we're going to be talking about your record Vislumbres, which I've had the honor and privilege of doing a Dolby Atmos mix for, which is going to be available for sale at the IAA shop. So I thought it would be cool if we could talk about kind of the story behind the record and the process of doing the Atmos mix and, any other things that come up relating to it. So to start, I think it would be cool if you could kind of introduce yourself to the viewers and talk a bit about your background.
So, hello, everyone. So again, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast. So my background, well, I graduated in music, sound production, more specifically in Brazil. And I worked as an audio engineer in the studio. I had my own studio too, for several years until I just really wanted to live abroad and, just learn more about audio and especially like the American music production, and engineering. So I wanted to be more involved in that. And I thought that a master's degree would be a good way to get that set up. And I went to American University. I did my master's in audio technology there. And then I just stuck around. What was supposed to be 2 years ended up being 11 years, I guess. So after I graduated, I started teaching, and it was a pleasure to teach. And I taught full time for, 7-8 years, until things changed. And then I moved back to Brazil. And then, I set up a studio here. I guess that's what I do. If I don't have a studio at hand, I build one.
So when I first met you I'm thinking, what was it, like the fall of 2021? Sounds about right.
That sounds about right, yeah.
I remember, I think I was the only student in the whole graduate program, whatever, that was interested in any kind of surround. And yeah. I remember for my capstone, I was looking to do some like mixing. I had just set up a little Atmos studio in my apartment in DC, which I did most of the mixing for this project on. And I remember you had sent me a couple tracks from this record that you were going to release in a couple months. So this was in like May or June of 23. And the record came out, I think, in November.
Yeah.
And I remember I had you up to my apartment, and I think it was the first time you had heard any kind of Atmos or anything.
Yeah, it was a new experience for sure.
So I think it's pretty cool that I found out, you got back in touch with me a while later and you were like, I built an Atmos studio. So I have to take a little bit of the credit for convincing you to take the plunge.
Oh yeah, you're definitely part of the journey. Yeah. And I learned so much from you. At the time, I was really, really focused on stereo. That's everything that I was used to doing. And when you came in, you showed we had a surround setup, right, at American University, that would, it wouldn't get used that much because people were really not that familiar with surround, unless it was a film project of some sort. But you would bring mixes, files that you found somewhere. I don't know where.
From things on the shelf.
Yeah, that explains it. Yeah. And it was like my first experience listening to mixes in surround. And it was not an Atmos studio, but, I started to see the potential of that format. I saw that some things really benefited from some spatial spread instead of having everything in the front, or in the phantom center between left and right speakers. And then, when I listened to some tracks in your setup, you brought that even further, that the potential of the Atmos format, which I was not yet familiar with.
Well, I always tell people, like, not every record needs to be mixed in this format. Like, if it's just someone playing acoustic guitar, then I don't really think there's any Atmos potential for that. But for things like your record, I wouldn't say like it's super dense, but there's a lot of like little bits of percussion. There's layered vocals on all the songs. Sometimes there's multiple guitar or keyboard parts, and it helps to have the extra space to kind of move all that stuff around and make it involving for the listener.
Yeah, I agree. I think the arrangements that are more complex, they benefit from they're easier to move from a stereo format to an Atmos format because you have more elements and then you have more speakers, so you can spread them out more. And yeah, if it's a super simple arrangement or just a more straightforward, I shouldn't say arrangement, more instrumentation, right? If it's a simple instrumentation or a more straightforward instrumentation, that it's more like this band approach, like drums, bass, guitar, vocals, and you're so used to listening to that in the front stage, then if you start moving things around, then you miss that cohesiveness, right? You kind of break that apart. So I, from my experience listening to Atmos mixes, I see that the arrangements, the instrumentations that are more complex, that have more elements, translate better to the Atmos format for sure.
So I thought it would be cool if we could do like a little sidebar on each of there's 8 songs on this record. I mean, you could talk a little bit about, how you wrote and recorded the song, and we could talk about the experience of doing the Atmos mix. But the first track, one of my favorites, Doce, Toxina. Take me back to when you recorded this piece. I assume all the songs were recorded at Kreeger.
Yeah, I recorded a lot of the vocals in my home studio in Washington, D.C. when I was living there. But most of it was recorded in Kreeger. So, as pretty much every song produced, and it started as a scratch, right? It's a start as an idea, a melodic idea. For that one, I remember that my original intention was to make something for my band, Color Palette, which I was playing with at the time, right? And then it didn't work out, but I kept the idea saved, and it started with that riff on the piano. Right?
Yeah, it's like sort of a descending thing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly like that semitone. So, and then later I developed it. I added the way that I usually write music is I start with this idea and then I create a MIDI mock-up arrangement. That's true for pretty much every song in this record. So I work with a MIDI bass, just to have some idea to see where it's going, like MIDI drums. And then later I invite real musicians because, they're going to come up with ideas that I would never think of. And of course, when you place the microphone and it just sounds so much better, it just sounds so much more real. So I invite the musicians. I may or may not send them my idea. It's like, it may be something like, I was thinking something along these lines. Or sometimes I send the version with, I don't know, the MIDI bass, for example. And then I send the version without it so that they can, play around without being biased by, my own idea. And I think that has worked really well for this album. So yeah, the bass in that track is actually a synthesizer, but then I had Janie Meyer, the guitarist and lead singer in Color Palette, play guitar.
He played the solo too?
Yeah, he played a solo too. Yeah. And then Benny Beausoleil, my good friend, amazing drummer, played drums on it and other tracks as well. Um, but yeah, and then I was really into singing. At that time, like I had enough voice lessons, and I was like, because on my previous two records, I would compose everything, I would build the arrangement, but I would invite other singers to sing. I might sing on one song, but I had guest singers. And for this one, I was like, I'm going to sing, and I'm going to sing in Portuguese. Just because, writing lyrics in Portuguese, it flows better for me since it's my first language.
Yeah, and I would say, like, it's not just singing. Like, there's a lot of like vocal production on this album. There's some complicated, like on this song, there's a triple tracked chorus and there's a double harmony part that comes in over it. So on some of the other songs are even denser in terms of layering up the vocals, which of course helped with the Atmos mix.
Yeah, it's I really love harmonies, and sometimes I ended up recording probably more tracks than I should, but I think it adds a texture, right? When you add layers, and that's something that I learned from American music production, particularly pop songs. They have so many vocal stacks, layered on top of the lead vocals, and doubling the vocal, adding a triple. And then adding several layers of harmonies is very common, and I just love to do it. So I just went to town with it.
So, from my perspective, getting the tracks from you, I mean, one thing I would say right off the bat is that the delivery that you gave me for this, it wasn't just like you printed stems, it was a Pro Tools session. And it had certain elements frozen, so, I could open the plugins that were on them. But you printed pretty much everything separately. So not only were there, discrete components for all the different vocals and guitars, and I think the drums were one piece on some songs and separate on the others, but you also printed all the reverbs separately. So there was like a separate vocal reverb, separate guitar reverb, which was helpful because you could have the sort of projections coming from different places. In this song, during the verses, there's this, like, I think we called it the drive guitar when we were exchanging notes, that happens sort of right in your head in the sides, and then it sends its delay to the back. So you could do all these kind of interesting things with time-based effects to make the mix feel really immersive. And in a lot of cases, that's kind of what we use the height speakers primarily for, mostly for these, send and return channels, and not so much for like very loud, isolated bits of instrumentation, though there are some of those throughout the record.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love the spatial placement that you did for these mixes. I think it's working really, really well in the Atmos format. Particularly the way you place the effects channels, right? And the way I mix, I use many different reverbs and delays. Right? And then it's nice. I saw that you got those and you spread them, throughout the speaker arrays, and I think that worked really well.
Yeah, I remember one of the things that we had a issue with on this song was the guitar solo, because I wanted to sort of make a cool moment by having it come out of the height speakers mostly, and it did sound good on speakers, but in the binaural it got like really buried, I remember. So we ended up having to sort of compromise and lower it a little bit. It is raised a little bit more than some of the other guitars in the song, but sometimes you have to compromise on these things to get the best experience across all the different ways people could listen to it.
Yeah, exactly. For translation, right? And I think it's a good approach. You begin with speakers, but then whenever you're doing something that is a little bit unusual, check on binaural to see if it's working, because that's how most people are going to listen to the music. Yeah.
Another thing I remember that came up at least for me, trying to sort of decide how I wanted to place everything, was what do you do with the center channel? Because people have different theories about this. You know, there's some mixers like Steven Wilson who will just put all the vocals in the center, and it sounds good on his stuff. And then you have other people who just don't use the center at all, and they leave the vocal as a, you know, either a stereo object or part of the bed, and it just doesn't use the center. So again, kind of like with the guitar thing, we compromised. So there is a dry vocal in the center on this album, but it's also at about maybe like half the level in the front speaker, so it sounds a little bit more integrated.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to increase width, you know, to the vocal track, to add some width. And I think that if you have something only in the center speaker, there is a timbral change, you know, and because of the room. Right, so and I remember that being something that I was constantly checking, you know, when I was listening to the stereo master, right, or to the stereo mix, and I was comparing to the Atmos mix. You know, I think the first pass you have the vocals only in the center speaker, right? If I'm not mistaken. And I was listening to the stereo, and then I was listening to the Atmos, and the timbre was different, and I have speaker calibration, you know, and but still, like in the room, because you have that speaker in a different placement, and also because it reaches the ears in a different way, right? There is that, and the timbre was different, and I couldn't get past that. I was like, and well, what is it? And it was a cool learning experience for me too. You know, why is it? Why does it sound different? Because I knew it was the same stem, and then we learned it was because it was only in the center channel. And then when we add some divergence to it, then not only it spread out, it added some width to the vocal track, but it also made the timbre more compatible with the stereo version.
I also had it like out in the room a little bit, which also caused a change too. And that was another thing we learned. Like in a lot of cases, I would have the elements that are assigned to the front, you know, like drums, bass, lead vocal, occasionally like some guitars. And I would sort of like back those off a little bit. So there's like a little bit of them in the sides just to make it seem a little more 3D. And again, like I thought it sounded kind of cool on speakers, but it creates, you know, you could kind of understand this with the headphones because it's very complex for whatever the binaural algorithm is to render these sort of very difficult positions, you know, like 80% front, 20% side. A lot of times it just ended up making the elements sound louder.
Yeah, exactly. That's the main thing that we noticed, right? It was whenever you moved things towards the center of the room, they sounded louder. And then, which is cool, you know, you can compensate for levels, but you can also keep them like, you know, against the wall.
Yeah.
But I remember that was something that we played around with.
So the second track, Hipnose. The note I put that was funny is because I remember this when you sent me the Pro Tools sessions. One of your reference tracks was a Harry Styles song for this. I think it was like As It Was, maybe.
Yeah. I think it was a different one. But
it was from that record.
Yeah, it was from that same record. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, Harry Styles' mixes are amazing, you know. And I always mix with reference tracks, and I set the bar really high. And I think that's beneficial, you know, in getting like the best possible result. And, you know, and a lot of it was because it had like similar instrumentation, right? Drums, bass, synthesizers, guitars, and whatnot, and vocals, of course. but yeah, and the Atmos mixes of Harry Styles are also really, really good.
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you used those as a reference when you were building the Atmos version. But yeah, Hipnose is a song that it also has an interesting background story. It was a song that I produced for a singer, and then later she was working with a record, and they kind of like vetoed, her from working with someone else. And so I broke it apart and I used some elements of it, and build a completely new song, but based on kind of the same blocks, that were there before. And the lyrics are about, the political polarization that, and people just being hypnotized by that, which, carries on to this time. The song was written, I don't know, 4 years ago, but it still applies. People trying to convince each other, but really not convincing anyone because there's really no dialogue. It's just, there's just like anger and like forcing someone's opinions and views onto others. So, I made the lyrics about that. And yeah, and then it was the same approach. I just, I started with a MIDI mock-up arrangement, and then I have I had live musicians. I had people play live, and then I recorded it. And on the guitar is my good friend James Reber, that also worked with me on some of my other productions. And on drums there's Dawson Bristol. There's Peter playing bass, and yeah, the people that were usually in my circle, that was part of my AU community, So,
well, that was the great thing about AU. Like whenever for class, like you needed someone to come in and track, there were always people around. And it's still like that. Yeah.
There are a ton of musicians around, and people are really, really willing to collaborate and play on each other's music.
Well, from what I remember, this was one of the denser pieces on the album. Like the choruses are pretty dense because you have those sort of big drums going. There's a lot of harmony parts. There are at least 4 doubles for the harmonies during the chorus. So that was cool. That was one opportunity. You have 4 height speakers, 4 doubles. You just put one at each corner, and it sounds cool.
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah, there are a lot of the layered things, right? So maybe there's drums, but there's a tambourine, accenting the snare, but then that is also doubled by a different kind of synthesizer percussion. And all of that is just to add density and texture and timbre richness, right? And again, it's a challenge in the stereo format because you have all those elements, and sometimes they resist coexisting with each other.
Yeah.
but in Atmos, you can really make that into something that can make the experience more immersive.
Yeah, the other thing I have on my notes is that this was one of the tracks where there was separation in the individual drum elements. Like you had a folder that had all the, kick, snare, hat, etc. So I think we kind of found through trial and error that it sounded best to generally keep the drums all in front, even if the elements were separate. Though there are other examples of, if you go on Apple Music, of people mixing albums where they do kind of a surrounding thing with the drums, and it sounds good. It's different, different situations, different records. But this was one of the songs where we did keep some of the toms in the back because, those during the chorus.
Yeah,
gives it a
exactly.
little extra lift. Yeah.
Yeah. Then again, it's a contrast between sections, right? That's such an important element in music production, right? And that contrast can become from timbral changes. That contrast can become from arrangement changes, right? Changes in density, that contrast can becomes from more reverb or less reverb, just to create a contrast and get the attention of the listener again, get the listener interested in the track again. And another way to create contrast in the Atmos format is to make things more immersive in certain sections and less immersive in other sections, right? And I think you did a great job with that. During the choruses, really spreading things out, and then maybe during the verses, not so much, right? And again, it's just it's a way to keep the attention of the listener, the interest of the listener in the track.
Yeah, exactly. So at track 3, Miguel. Renascer de amor latente. Eu sei que nada vai ficar no mesmo lugar. Which as I recall, was a ballad written about your son, right?
Yeah, that is a song that I made to my son when he was still in the making. When my wife was pregnant. And yeah, that started with a piano and vocal idea. And the same, I knew I wanted it to be more acoustic, more on the acoustic side. And as you can see in my album, there are tracks that are very acoustic, and there are tracks that have more synthesizers and electric guitars and different timbres. And for that one, it was drums, and that was also played by Benny Beausoleil, my good friend. And there's acoustic bass, right? And then Josh Hunter, which is he has another project called Endless Winter, which is really cool. I would recommend checking it out. He was going to release an album. I'm not sure if he has released it already, but anyway. So definitely worth checking him out. And I sent the track to him because when I mixed it, I just did a rough mix, and it was missing something more ethereal, something more spatial, something more texture, texturized, and he has so many guitar pedals.
And I was going to ask you, like, the guitar tones in this song are super weird. Like,
they're different, right? But that is his thing. Like, he's constantly looking for different sounds, some sounds that are not so conventional. I was always fascinated by his way of coming up with different timbres and different sound by using a combination of pedals and different like techniques, running this pedal into that pedal and then into this amplifier and whatnot. So I just thought that he would be the perfect fit for it. And yeah, and a lot of that sound, a lot of that ethereal sound that I really love about this track come from Josh's guitar sounds, So I think he did a great job that, and he emphasized some melodic lines on the piano with the guitars, but it changed the whole vibe of the track. The addition of those guitar layers.
Yeah, because like I could picture like just you singing and playing the piano, like that would have been appropriate for the song. It would have been different, but that is the essence of the song.
Yeah. But it's just because the guitar layers make the song a lot more spacious, and And that is true for the stereo version as well, but of course with Atmos it gets enhanced.
Well, in Atmos, like this one was easy. It was just kind of like the piano in front, and then we could use the extra space for those different guitars. I think there was one in the side and one in the back. And then the guitars have reverb inherent in them from the pedals, but you also added like digital reverb on top of that. So you get this kind of fluidity to it where there's like a half second. You could almost sort of feel like smoke rising to the top every time those guitars hit. And I love stuff like that. It's perfect for Atmos. So track 4, Meu Eu. I think that's how you say it, right?
Yeah, Meu Eu is just a different way of saying myself, that song is more, introspective, esoteric, if you will. But it's and I had the honor to have Noah Gatz, which is the saxophone teacher at American University, play on it. We worked together on many of his projects, many of his recordings. And then at one point we were recorded at AU, and we were working on one of his projects, and they said, "Hey, I have this song that I think would be really cool with a flute solo." And he brought the flute, and he even shaved. I remember that he shaved because it would make it better to play the flute. And then the flute sounded cool, when we listened in the studio, and it was like one of those things like, okay, that sounds cool. Can we just check on the saxophone, on the sax soprano? And then it was just like everything clicked. It was like, yeah, that is the sound. That is the sound that we want. And it was the solo that ended up being in the record is the last solo that he did, which was just for like an Instagram video, that we shot at the end, because we already had a very, very good solo, and I was like, let me just shoot a video, just to post something on Instagram, and then that solo was just killer.
Yeah,
I really love this. I really love the sax solo on that track.
It's like, I don't want to say like there's something like a little sad about it, the solo. It's kind of like you're like looking out the window as the sun's going down. Like it's got that kind of vibe.
Yeah, which match the lyrics and everything. It's about like finding oneself again, and that track came up with that piano idea before I came to the US. So that piano idea was like, I don't know, some 10 years old at the time.
Oh, wow.
And then it was just there. It was just on my phone, and I developed it. It was like during the pandemic. I was teaching a class about music production. Right? It was called Project Studio Production. And one of the themes that we touched on was, how can one take on a project, like a writing project, a song composition, and take it to the end, right? Finish it. Because that's so hard. We come up with a lot of ideas, and then, but a lot of them get abandoned. And I find that to be true with a lot of, songwriters and composers and producers. So, and I was like, I'm going to embark on that journey with you, with my students. I'm going to get that idea that is like, in that digital drawer full of mold, and I'm going to resurface it. And as you work on your tracks, I'm going to work on mine, and that was a really, really cool project. And so we recorded bass over a Zoom meeting. It was a class, right? It was like about remote collaboration, and not the technology involved and all of that. And Jean Francis, uh, a, amazing musician, singer, bassist. He agreed to participate, and then he played the bass. He recorded the bass over the track remotely. As I was giving him directions remotely, not really directions, kind of like just production cues. I was engineering remotely, but he was recording everything on his end, on his computer, and then he just sent the files to me, and we did that live as part of a class. So that was really cool. And then I just kept recording, kept adding elements, and then I sent the file to a drummer that was in Brazil, because I remember this was about remote collaboration. It was during the pandemic. It was 2021. So I sent the scratch track to this drummer, and then he a Gima, right? Gima drum, and he played drums on it, and then he sent the stems, and then he just added the stems, and then I recorded the guitars, live, and then I had a student, Knox Engler, play the guitar, and he did a really good job playing the acoustic guitar. I tried to do it on my own, like the electric guitar. That is me.
So you're talking about that part that goes like dun 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 dun. You know what I'm talking about? Right?
Yeah.
Yes.
That one. And I couldn't come up with good acoustic. I knew it needed an acoustic guitar, but I couldn't come up with good ideas because my guitar playing is limited. So, and then Knox just came in and he just played a lot of cool guitar parts. And so anyway, that's how we kind of assembled this song. It was through overdubs, and part of it was remote, and then part of it was in the studio. And I think the last part was the saxophone. And
my favorite part of the track is after the solo, there's this moment where like suddenly the backing vocals come in, and the sax is playing like a harmony with itself.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really, in the Atmos mix, it really fills up the whole room because we put the backing vocals mostly in the tops, kind of, next to you and up a little bit.
Yeah, it's like a post-chorus bridge of some sort where there's a modulation, right?
Yes,
the chords change and everything. I like that. I like that part too.
So track 5, which I said was the most complicated of all of them, and you said it was your favorite track, I think. Danca de Vida.
Yeah. So, that track it's just essentially about a midlife crisis, and I invited Danizan to sing with me. I knew from the start that that would be like a 2 singers piece.
Yep.
So I remember I began with I really wanted her to sing on it. So I learned about her register, about her vocal range. And I was like, I think this is going to be good for her vocal range. Let's see if it works with mine. And then, we found like a key that would work for both of us. And then I just started writing the song with that in mind. There would be 2 singers. Again, it started with a mock-up arrangement, a MIDI mock-up arrangement, some basic drums ideas, some basic bass ideas, and then I just had, my dear friends musicians play on it. And Evan Rieger, who plays bass on it, came up with such a cool bass line. I just love the bass lines on that track, you know. The bass lines are quite elaborated.
The whole thing's
I'd
like
say.
it's like very bouncy. My favorite part in it is there's this guitar that comes in like towards the end of the verse, like dun 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 dun. You know which one I'm yeah.
Yeah. And that's also Janie Meyer, my dear friend that is the mind behind Color Palette. I love his guitar parts on this song. And I had Marcio Rosa, a percussionist, lay down percussion tracks and then send them over to me. So that was done remotely. So one of the things that I found out from teaching that class, on remote collaboration is that, I learned a lot of things from that class, with remote collaboration. So they just kept it, throughout the album. So there are many remote collaborations where I just sent people the scratch track, and then they just send me back the stems, and then they just mix them in.
So for me mixing this track, because it's a duet, I figured like you could do some interesting stuff in Atmos, right? Because the vocals kind of trade off. And in the stereo version, you have a bit of automation going on where usually when one of you is singing alone, it's centered. And then when it's together, they're kind of offset a little bit. Like it's not like there's one on the left and one on the right, but it's like maybe 20-20, something like that.
Yeah.
So in the early version, I did try putting like her voice in the back on a lot of it, because I figured that would kind of be a cool way of taking the stereo and turning on its side. But usually like it just doesn't work. Like when you have someone singing by themselves from the back. So we kind of ended up reverting it back to how the stereo was.
Yeah. And it's again, it's about where do you want the attention of the listener to be, right? I mean, I can turn around to see like the singer that is in the back. I think it works really well when you have like a harmony track, or maybe particularly a harmony track, and it's just one, right? It's not double. You just have the one harmony track, and then you can put that in the back. And I think you did that for one of the tracks. I think it's Perdoe, right?
Yeah.
But for this, like the way I envision, it's like just the two singers like singing together. So,
but there is one moment where we kept the surround automation, where like there's a quick trade off where her voice kind of goes left side, right side, and then back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when we're breaking down the sentences, and then I sing kind of half of it, and then she just sings like a word or two, and then I think that worked really well.
And then there's that whole like breakdown instrumental section where I had sent this to someone because I asked like a bunch of people I know about opinions when I was mixing it, and someone told me they thought the bridge was Tim Burton-esque. I thought that was kind of a cool way of describing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember and that has a lot of textural elements, right? The guitars, and it's really different from the rest of the song, and I remember like asking you, go to town with this, like make things spin, make it a tornado.
I think that was the one time on the record where you were like, you're not going far enough with this, like really like go to town, like because that's what the music is suggesting.
Yeah, true. And I'm really, really happy with the result.
Yeah, I ended up doing that. So one of the things that's annoying about my new system, so I'm using Pro Tools with the internal renderer now, and on my old, when I first did it, I had the external renderer, which I still have anyway. It's useful just for listening to ADMs. But when you're working with the external renderer, Dolby makes this plugin you can get called the Music Panner. And it has like a built-in sequencer where you can literally like just draw moves with the mouse, and it's synced to the tempo of the session. So if you want something to like really move in a perfect circle and you can control the speed of it, it's very useful for doing that. And on the new system, you can't use it because it doesn't work with the internal renderer. So to do the pans for that guitar, I did it like by hand. Like I put the thing in right mode and I just kind of moved the mouse around. It took a couple of tries to get it like sounded good.
Yeah. But a good thing about it is that you can actually, you can listen as you do it, and kind of interact with the song in that way, right?
I was at like a seminar a couple months ago where there was an engineer talking about this particular thing, and he said he always does the pans by hand because they have like a certain character to them, because you're inherently, it's like not going to be perfect because it's done by a human as opposed to the sequencer thing. So it makes it like a little more exciting because it's kind of rough sounding. So hopefully that's how this came across.
Oh yeah, definitely. Again, you're interacting with the track, right? Instead of just, setting up a setting and then playing. So it's imperfect, but it's also interactive and exciting, and you have that immediate feedback, of where is it now? Where is it going? Where should I go? How long should I take to get there, to get to that speaker?
Yeah, so. I feel like if I end up doing enough of this work, I want to get like a joystick so I could really
Oh yeah. And or one of those, or a setup where you have a camera and then you move your hand and it tracks your hand. I have a good friend of mine that is working on something on something similar.
Oh yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
But since you mentioned it before, track 6, Perdoe is the way you say it?
Yeah, Perdoe.
So the first thing I'll say about this track is that the bass is huge on it. So I'm curious what you did tracking wise to get that sound.
Well, that's an SVT amp, an MPEG SVT, and I have a really good friend of mine, Leonardo Brito, play the bass on it. Amazing bassist. And he is Brazilian, but he came to visit me in Washington, D.C. And he spent about a week with me there. And I was showing him, the tracks that were in production at that time. I was like, I need a bassist for this track. Can you play on it? And then we went to the studio and he played. And it has like this reggae vibe, even though I wouldn't say it's a reggae track.
It's got that like sort of slow up and down thing that reggae has.
And it has like the guitars on the upbeats and whatnot. And I think that reggae vibe became more apparent when Rafael Pondé, which plays guitar on this track, laid down his part. He is a reggae musician. He of course he plays other genres, but he plays reggae really well. And when he played guitar, like that was immediately the vibe that he went for. The wah-wah guitar and whatnot. And we tracked the bass after that. So he just followed along, and I think I had like a MIDI bass of some sort, but he just kind of, went on with that vibe, with that reggae vibe.
Who played the strings on that track?
That was Laura Schwartz. She also goes by Bellwether Bayou. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I saw her live. She plays the violin with a pedal, with a loop pedal. And she's really, really amazing on stage. I think she lives in Singapore now, but she used to live in Washington, D.C. And we played together on a project. And I was, when I made the song, I was like, a violin would be really, really cool on this track. And I thought of her, and I shoot her an email, and she agreed. And again, I had a MIDI mock-up with some ideas, but then she just used those as you know, a guideline. But then she came up with her own ideas, and I think it worked really well. You know, she played harmonies and pizzicatos and whatnot. I think that, you know, the violin is really the star on this track, and it's a song that I made for my wife. So you know, it's special for us. My son loves to hear it. It's like, oh, can we listen to Mama's song? Can we listen to Mama's song? So he loves listening to that song. But yeah, that was Laura Schwartz.
And in the Atmos mix, we did put the strings in the ceiling.
Yeah. And it sounds really good. It really sounds like, you know, like fluctuating. And yeah, it really worked there.
And the other thing you mentioned was the starting in like the second verse, you're doing kind of like an almost falsetto, just a single harmony, like it's a mono element. And I think in the first version, I had tried putting it in the rear surrounds. So, you know, for people watching in a 714 setup, you know, there's speakers on the side and there's ones that are behind you. I think we thought it was a little too jarring to have it like all the way behind, so we ended up putting it in the sides. So if you're listening where those speakers are kind of, usually they're between 90 and 120 degrees are the recommended specs. So it kind of sounds like it's in the middle of your head, like you have the main voice in front of you and then this harmony comes in like right there. Super cool effect.
Oh yeah, I agree. And I've heard that same approach, you know, in other tracks where you just have the one harmony line. Right?
I mean, it's pretty rare for a modern production that you have sections with one harmony. Like usually people really stack things up. On older records, it's not uncommon.
Yeah, true. And I remember I tried stacking harmonies on this one and just didn't work. It was not really complementing the track because I think it's more intimate, you know, it's a love song, and for someone specifically. So just it didn't need a hyper production, you know, of 4-6 different harmony tracks. I think the song was really made for a more simple instrumentation. You know, I think that would help with the message more than overproducing it.
Yeah, I mean, especially the acoustic tracks on the album, like the next track, the title song, which we're going to talk about right after this.
Yeah.
There's enough parts to spread around to make it interesting in Atmos, but there's still like a lot of space, even in the stereo mixes. So I think your instincts were correct in how to present the songs.
Esperas tardias perturbam a paz. Quem dera eu pudesse despir-me do que não serve mais.
Yeah, Vislumbres is another one that was acoustic, and the same bassist that played the acoustic bass on Miguel also played the acoustic bass on Vislumbres. And I envision an accordion for that track, and I know an amazing accordion player, Rafael Meninão. He lives in Brazil, and at the time I sent him the tracks and he played the accordion on it and I sent it back, and it was just beautiful. So yeah, and it has the same vibe as Perdoe and Miguel, even though Miguel has more ethereal elements. Vislumbres is more acoustic, and it's about being homesick. You know, at that time it was also during the pandemic. I was missing home, and that song has that kind of nostalgic feeling to it.
Yeah, and you know, from a mixed perspective, I think there isn't really that much to say about this one. It's just kind of guitar on one side, accordion on the other. Then there's a couple other. There's like a some kind of like hand drum part that we put in the back.
Yeah. There's I think there's Buddha drum. That's what's called. It's like a a jar, a ceramic jar that,
I
and
remember.
that was also Marcio Haza. But I think this one is the Atmos mix is kind of like an enhancement of the stereo mix, right?
Yes.
So, for example, the guitar and accordion are panned left and right, but then on the Atmos mix they're panned surround left and surround right. Right? Maybe there's some divergence with the front speakers as well.
In the surrounds, yeah.
Yeah.
When you're listening in the sweet spot, it feels more like they're closer to you than they would be than just the front.
And on speakers, when you place elements on the surround speakers, right, the ones that are like aiming like at your sides, it sounds similar to the experience of listening to something that is panned left and right, like a stereo mix that has elements panned left and right, on headphones, right? Because like when you listen, when it's a stereo mix and something is panned hard left and hard right, they play like right in your ear, right? But when you listen on speakers, they sound in the front, even when you pan them hard left and hard right. But when you pan them to the side speakers, to the surround left and right, then you have that same feeling as you have when you're listening on headphones, which is kind of cool.
And then when you listen to the Atmos mix on headphones and you have stuff like hard left and right in the sides, it sounds like it's sort of beyond where the headphones end.
Yeah,
like those speakers are the ones I find have the most like wow factor when you're listening in binaural.
True,
like on some of the other channels, like if you put something in like say the rear left, like a lot of the times it just kind of sounds quieter. Like it sounds good on speakers, but I think that explains why when you listen to a lot of records on Apple Music that have been mixed in Atmos, the producers tend to make more use of the sides than the back, and I suspect it has to do with binaural translation.
I think it has to do with binaural translation. I think it has to do with timbre perception. Because when you place something on your sides, like they're aiming directly at the ear, so you have like a like the timbral quality tends to be more accurate. When you put something in on the rears, then now your head is interfering a little bit, right? The pinna is interfering a little bit, so it sounds a little duller. It sounds a little bit less. Like it's more difficult to really localize where they are, in my experience.
I find
it's like it's like there's somewhere here. But like when you place and up until the 90-degree angle, like you can have a really, really accurate spatial cue. Like you'd know where those elements are, and their timbre is full. Like the high end is crisp and whatnot. As soon as you get beyond 90 degrees, then things tend to sound duller and less precise in terms of localization, at least in my experience.
I was going to say, like, I just find that they're the rear surrounds, at least to me, are the most difficult speakers to figure out how to, like, utilize in the mix. Because, like you said, you can't really put anything that's too important in them because it's going to get masked in the headphones. And even like you were just saying on speakers, because of the nature of how we hear things, it's going to sound a little bit duller. And you can account for that by using EQ to make it a little bit brighter, which helps with that sort of thing. But I think we found that generally they're good for things that kind of jump out at specific moments. Like a drum that only plays during the chorus, or like a harmony vocal that only... things that kind of come and go that aren't consistent.
Exactly.
And also, there are things like if you lose them, it doesn't like mess up the song. Like
True.
if you were to kill those speakers, you should still like the core of the song should still be there, I think.
Yeah. No, I agree. They can be used to create contrast. Yeah, and as you mentioned, like single events and whatnot, elements that come and go. I think that's where the rear speakers live. And of course, reverb and whatnot, especially if you have an immersive recording, something that was recorded in a 704 or 504, 502, whatever format. And you have those pan to the rear speakers, like the microphones that were aiming at the back of the room, when you have those pan to the rear speakers, when you're listening to the full mix and then you mute the rear speakers, you miss it. It sounds less enveloping.
Or
even though when you're listening to it, it's like it's difficult to really tell, what is happening on the rear speakers, because it gets really diffused. But when you mute it, it's like, okay, now I miss it, because it becomes less enveloping and less real.
Yeah. I mean, even if you have something like, I know, like you can record with like a 704 array, which people have done, like Justin Gray. But even if you just have like a stereo, like room pair on the drums, like you've, a pair of like 414s that are a couple feet back, like those sound great if you put them in the rear speakers, and then you have the dry drums in the front.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Room microphones and stuff like that. Yeah. And again, it gives you that sense of immersiveness. But without really giving you really, really refined spatial cues. That has been my experience so far, at least.
So there's one track left, which is The Distance to the Sun, which is a cover, and it's the only song sung in English on the album.
There is a world apart from what we know. There is a time the eyes will never show. We can be as one and be farther than the distance to the sun.
Yeah. So, as you know, I have a soft spot for prog rock, particularly Spock's Beard, right? So I really wanted to create an acoustic version, of an otherwise like progressive rock song. And this is a song that I really love. And I was, just listening to a bunch of songs. I was like, okay, this could really work. And of course I simplified the arrangement, because, prog rock songs can be very long. So I simplified it a little bit, and I wanted to have a song that is just piano and vocals, and yeah. So I a lot of the elements that are present in the guitars and whatnot on the original song, I moved to the piano, and then just sing on top of it.
And as far as what's on the session, like it basically is just a solo performance, except in the last chorus there are a couple of harmonies.
Yeah, it's simple, and I thought it would be a good way to end the album.
Yeah. And to mix it in Atmos, like there weren't really that many options with the song, because it is basically just you playing solo. So this was the one example on the record where we kept, like we were talking about before, how on the first pass I had kind of backed things up a little bit. Like if it was a stereo element, like I'd sort of place it between the front and side, so it sounded a little bit closer to you. And since the piano is the only element playing in the song, we ended up keeping that. So in this one, the piano is not so much on the front wall. It's kind of enveloping you a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that worked really well, and I think I love how spatial it sounds on binaural, to the piano. It really sounds, because when you're listening to headphones on stereo, like you have that in the head localization thing, but then on binaural it tends to move things away from your head, and I think that is particularly perceivable on this track. On the piano, because vocals we didn't use binaural on vocals, right? Because it changes the timbre. There's that.
Yeah.
So we kept it off, at least for the Dolby binaural or the Apple Spatial Audio. You really have no choice. Every element becomes binauralized.
Yes.
So, but for this album, all of the vocals are set to off, because when you add the binaural, the HRTF curves, it changes the timbre. And that can work really well on a lot of instruments, but on vocals it becomes very noticeable because, you know, as humans we are very sensitive to timbral changes in human voice particularly. So,
and I can say, like, from having looked at other people's ADMs, like, that's not an uncommon practice. If the vocals are placed on an object, usually it's turned off.
Yeah.
So I also just wanted to ask you some follow-up questions. So the first of which being that when we finished working on the mixes, you know, exchanging ADMs back and forth, you mastered the final version. And Atmos mastering is kind of a whole new field that there are certain people who specialize in, but for the most part, I would say most Atmos mixes go out unmastered, or the person who mixes them kind of masters them in the mix. So I'm curious kind of what your process was here and kind of what you thought of the whole experience of doing that.
Well, I think so. Just, you know, what I've learned about mastering for Atmos, you know, so far, is that it's still, like, similar to the stereo. It's still about finalizing the material, right? And in Atmos, really, it's some people don't go to a mastering engineer. You know, they mix and kind of release it in Atmos. In my experience, it's just, it becomes too much, you know. When you are mixing, when you're deciding on the spatial placement of the elements, and, you know, and effects and automation, and then you also have to account for adhering to Dolby specifications, checking translation across formats. It just becomes too much, you know, for a similar reason that usually mixing engineers hire mastering engineers to work in the stereo format. I mean, you can mix in the stereo format and master it yourself, but it becomes too much, and at that point you may be fatigued already, you know, or you might not be sensitive enough to certain things that could use a little touch, you know, a little correction or a little enhancement. You're just not listening to those anymore, you know, because you're too involved. And on the technical side, you know, it's like the session becomes too complex, you know, and when you not only mix, but you also, you know, using the techniques for mastering all in the same session, it can get quite complicated.
One of the interesting things about Atmos is that the bounce and the session are kind of the same file in a way.
Yeah.
Because you can open the ADM and it will display all the ADMs as the mono tracks. It won't give you, like, the plugins the person used, like it's not a Pro Tools session, but it is kind of like getting, like, a post-production multi-track, I would say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like getting the stamps.
So when you want to do something like a normal thing I would do if I was mixing an album in stereo is I would put all my stereo bounces in a new session and I would just kind of tweak the clip gain so the album flows the way I want it to. You know, like maybe when I was mixing, like the session for track 3 was like 3 dB louder than it should be. And it's not so easy to do that with an Atmos mix because you can't just dump all your bounces in one session. Of course, Dolby makes this thing they call the album assembler that will let you do this, but you have to pay for it. So there are these added challenges, even if you're not going to do things like, you know, tweak the EQ and dynamic compression, that you may want to send it to somebody else just to kind of deal with that. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think, you know, when you're doing the spatial remixing, right, of a stereo mix, I think it's good to use the stereo mix as the reference, not the stereo master, right? Because there are, you know, very pronounced dynamic changes and timbral changes. And you might be pursuing that, and if you're comparing to the stereo master, you might be using that as a reference, and that might be a little bit misleading because that was really part of the mastering process, you know?
Yeah.
So I think it's good to, if you're doing the spatial remixing, you use the stereo mix as your reference. And then even if you're mastering yourself, I think it's good to export the ADM, import it into a brand new session. It's like, okay, now I'm mastering, and I'm going to use the stereo master as my reference, right? So
to be clear, the stereo version of Vislumbres was mastered by an outside engineer, but the references you sent me were your finished mixes before they went to this outside person. And the stereo masters do sound different. Like the EQ is a little bit different.
Yeah.
You would know better than me the minute differences, but like when you're A-Bing between them, like if you just toggle between them Pro Tools, they do sound different. Yeah,
true. And and again, it just becomes too much to think about when you're mixing and mastering, particularly in the same session. So I mean, if you're mastering it yourself, then I would certainly, export the ADMs, give it a week, for the ears to kind of reset, and then import it into a new session and master it. But again, you're not gonna, for the same reasons that it's beneficial to have a mastering engineer for stereo work, it would be good to have, someone else with fresh ears, with experience, to make sure that the track adheres to the specifications, make sure that the track works as best as it can in that particular format, make sure that it translates well across different formats, make sure that it has the same intent as the stereo master, right?
Yeah.
It has the same vibe, it has the same intent, it follows the same artistic vision as a stereo format. But again, it's about finalizing the material, and sometimes it needs like very, very subtle adjustments. Sometimes maybe not so subtle, but again, it's that last touch before it gets delivered.
So another question I had was, hypothetically, if you were making this record now and you knew there was going to be an Atmos mix, what would be some things you might have done differently in the recording process?
That's a very great question. I think the format becomes very inherent, becomes very embedded, as part of the production process. And we see that in stereo all the time, right? You record a vocal track, and then you record two harmonies, and because you're going to pan them left and right. You record a shaker, and then like, what I'm going to do with that shaker, I'm going to pan it to the left. Okay, now I have a hole on the right, so I have to record a tambourine and pan it to the right. So you're always looking for symmetry, for balance, right? When you're in the stereo production. So that left and right becomes like embedded in the production aspect, and when you're conceiving the arrangement, right? Even though a lot of the times we're not really conscious about it. Using stereo mic techniques, for example. So I think when you have the immersive format in your mind, one can really think about the arrangement for that format, right? So I'm gonna have, horns on one side, and I'm gonna have strings on the other side, and I'm gonna have drums in front, and then I'm gonna have these elements in the back. And as you're overdubbing, as you're composing, as you're thinking about the arrangement, you're kind of like thinking about their spatial placement already, just like we are so used to doing in stereo, right? So I think that's what I would do differently.
Yeah,
I would think about the placements of the instruments, and maybe I would overdub more elements, if I had that format in mind. And that's one of them. And I think the other one is immersive recording techniques. I've been experimenting a lot with immersive recording techniques, and that makes the track so much more spatial. When you record with it could be like a 502 array. That already makes a huge difference. Like if you record your room, with an immersive array, and you can still have the closed mics, but when you open up that room, it becomes so much more enveloping. So that's another thing that I would do differently.
I mean, the things that I would say to people, like, is in terms of workflow changes, or I would say definitely print your effects separately because it gives you more options, regardless of whether they're multi-channel or stereo. And I would say don't use a common reverb send, because I know people do that in stereo because it's only in 2 speakers anyway. Like if you're sending reverbs to one send, what does it matter? But you don't want to end up in a position where you're trying to fill 11 speakers and you just have one stereo track that has the reverb of all the instruments. Yeah.
Yeah, true. Yeah. And I think it's still, you can still, like, if you have, I don't know, 2 acoustic guitars, maybe you can still have the that same reverb for both, because they're going to be part of the same zone and whatnot. But like it's good to have multiple layers, right?
But you don't
reverbs
want,
and delays.
You don't want like your drum reverb on the same
exactly
track
on the same channel. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Because that's going to limit your spatial placement. Yeah.
Or in some cases, you just get the stems with the reverb burned in, like you get 2 channels of drums with reverb, and like people have ways of making things work. Most Atmos mixes, certainly of new productions, are done from stems, and a lot of them sound really good. So there are always solutions. So I always ask people this question, just as like a fun aside, but what are some of your favorite Atmos mixes that other people have done?
I love Steven Wilson's Harmony Codex. I mean, it's a beautiful album, and it's really, really immersive. I think it did a really, really great job there, in terms of the composition and the mix and everything. Monkey House's Crashbox, such a good, which you introduced me to, and
get it from the IA site. It's available now.
yeah, I've listened to it a bunch of times. It's so good. I was really struck by Justin Gray's Immersed, as I'm sure you are too. And that really shows like the potential of the Atmos format when you record everything with an immersive array.
Well, people have been saying since this format came out, like somebody's got to make a record that's designed especially for this, and they use all immersive techniques, and he actually did it, and it's killer. Yeah,
it's killer. It's really, really a reference in this format. There's this Brazilian artist, Maria Gadu, right? And she has an album, Quem Sabe Isso Quer Dizer Amor. I think the translation would be, maybe that means love. and I really like the spatial placement of the elements of that album. Like, they were not afraid of using the top speakers, and there's some what I would call unusual placements that really, really work, for this particular album. So anyway, that was a bunch of albums.
You're gonna have to send me that last one, because I've never heard that.
Yeah, I will.
And my other question is, if you could have any record that hasn't been done in Atmos, and to have an Atmos version, whether you would be the one mixing it or somebody else, which records would you like to have in Atmos that aren't available yet?
Well, there's an album that I really love. I love this artist, Emiliana Tohini. She's Icelandic, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, I've been listening to her for a long time. And she has this album with the Colorist Orchestra, which is called Racing the Storm. I think this album would be perfect for an Atmos mix, and I would love to mix it in Atmos format, because it has so many percussive elements, and they're all really unique, and it seems like they're made for for an immersive format. And they're not, the instruments are not so conventional. They're different timbres, different sounds, like really, really cool sounds, really, really awesome sound choices. The sound design of this album was amazing. And because they're not so traditional, I think there's a lot of flexibility. There would be a lot of flexibility with placing those elements around.
Oh, that's cool. I'm gonna have to check that out. I mean, my answer on this changes like every day, but my answer for today, if I had to pick one older record that would be great in Atmos mix, I would pick, because I know it's an album you like too, Dream Theater's Scenes from Memory.
Oh, epic. Yeah. Epic album.
And it could happen because they did their newest record in Atmos, so who knows?
Ah, cool. I gotta check it out. Yeah.
Well, Roger, thanks so much for coming on, and appreciate all your help, working on the Atmos mix and the whole collaborative nature of this project. And I hope people enjoy the record now that it's out. I would put this up against anything out there. I think it sounds really good. So
thank you.
Yeah.
You're part of it. Yeah, glad to be here, and I really appreciate your work with IAA, and yeah, looking forward to our next talk.
Yeah, we're working on another immersive project right now that hopefully people will be able to hear more about pretty soon.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
All right, thanks.